Within Alaska are 8 national parks, from the tallest peak in North America to a temperate rainforest in the largest national park in the US. Each of these parks has something unique to offer. Today we are going to take a brief tour of every national park in Alaska, starting with the first park to be created in the state, Denali. Denali National Park and Preserve was the first national park to be established in Alaska and the 11th in the nation on February 26, 1917. This park hosts 7,408 square miles of Alaskan wilderness, making it the third largest national park in the country at a size slightly smaller than New Jersey. The most notable feature of this park, Mount Denali, formerly Mount McKinley, is the tallest peak in both the United States and the entirety of North America, at 20,310 feet above sea level. Denali comes from a Native American word for the High One and has been the name of the mountain since 2015. The previous name, Mount McKinley, commemorated the 25th President of the United States, William McKinley. The history of this park can be traced back to early mountaineers, including the influential conservationist Charles Sheldon. Sheldon would conceive the idea of establishing Denali, then called McKinley, as a national park in 1906, first sharing his idea with his fellow members of the Boone and Crockett Club. Sheldon and his associates decided that they would firstly secure the support of Alaska's sole congressman, James Wickersham, and the local population. After drafting a bill, it was brought to Wickersham, who approved. Wickersham would introduce this bill to the House, while Nevada Senator Key Pittman would introduce it to the Senate. After passing both chambers of Congress, President Woodrow Wilson would sign the bill into law, thereby establishing McKinley National Park. From the conception of the park, its name was subject to criticism. In 1980, President Jimmy Carter signed the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act into law, incorporating McKinley National Park into a larger protected area named Denali National Park and Preserve. The mountain itself, however, was still named Mount McKinley, until President Barack Obama directed the Secretary of the Interior to rename Mount McKinley to Denali on August 30th, 2015. Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve was the second national park to be established in Alaska and the 42nd in the country on December 2nd, 1980, some 63 years after Denali. Gates of the Arctic, like every park in Alaska outside of Denali, was established by the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, an act that more than doubled the size of the national park system. The park is the northernmost national park in the US, lying entirely above the Arctic Circle. Gates of the Arctic is also the second largest national park in the country, with an approximate area of 13,238 square miles, making it larger than the state of Maryland. The park lacks any infrastructure. Because of this, along with the extreme latitude, it is the least visited national park, receiving a mere 10,047 visitors in 2016. The history of this park can be traced back to conservationist Robert Marshall in the 30s. Marshall was first coined the name when, while trekking through the Alaskan wilderness, he noted a pair of unusually steep mountains, describing them as Gates of the Arctic. Marshall would continue to study the vast Arctic landscape, mapping his multiple expeditions throughout the years. As the Arctic began to be used increasingly for industry following the Second World War, conservationists began to worry that these vast, untouched wildernesses would be damaged. These concerns led to Secretary of the Interior Stuart Udall urging President Lyndon B. Johnson to designate Gates of the Arctic, along with several other Alaskan areas, as national monuments. President Johnson, however, declined. President Jimmy Carter would step in and establish Gates of the Arctic as a national monument, until, in 1980, he would sign the Alaskan National Interest Lands Conservation Act that promoted Gates of the Arctic, along with 6 other Alaskan parks, to national park status. Glacier Bay National Park and Preserve was the third national park to be established in Alaska and the 43rd in the nation. The southernmost national park in Alaska, Glacier Bay is located between the Gulf of Alaska and the Canadian province of British Columbia. With a land area of 5,131 square miles, The park is around the same size as the American territory of Puerto Rico and hosts over 1,045 glaciers, covering 27% of its total land area. The park's history begins with the HMS Discovery, a British ship captained by George Vancouver that explored Glacier Bay and its surrounding areas in 1794. Conservationist John Muir would visit Glacier Bay 85 years later in 1879, canoeing from Fort Wrangell to the bay. Through an assortment of writings, Muir attracted the attention of William Skinner Cooper, an ecologist at the University of Minnesota, who would write a report for the Ecological Society of America. This report suggested that Glacier Bay be protected as a national monument. The ESA drafted resolutions relating to the Glacier Bay National Monument, which were then forwarded to President Calvin Coolidge, the National Park Service, and the Governor of Alaska. President Coolidge would designate Glacier Bay a national monument on February 26, 1925. In the following years, a proposal to expand the borders from the St. Elias Range to the Wrangell Range was suggested, eventually leading to the founding of the separate Wrangell-St. Elias National Monument and later National Park. President Jimmy Carter upgraded the status of Glacier Bay National Monument to National Park on December 2, 1980, under the Alaskan National Interest Lands Conservation Act. Katmai National Park and Preserve was the fourth national park to be established in Alaska and the 44th in the country. Covering 6,395 square miles, the park is around 850 square miles larger than Connecticut. Katmai's brown bear and salmon populations are, along with Brook Falls, perhaps the most famous aspect of the park. At these falls, brown bears can frequently be seen fishing for salmon as they swim upstream. Artifacts dating to around 6,000 years ago have been discovered along the southern coast of the park, with the earliest records of Katmai being from Russian fur traders in the 1760s, who would even establish a base known as Katmai Village in the following decades. Alaska was sold to the U.S. in 1867, with hunting and trapping remaining major industries in Katmai. By 1898 and continuing into the new century, earthquakes would strike the park relatively frequently, culminating in the eruptions of the Katmai and Nova Erupta volcanoes in 1912, leaving the surrounding area devastated. The National Geographic Society would back expeditions to Katmai throughout the following years, beginning in 1915. This first expedition was led by botanist Robert Griggs, who would lead several more expeditions in the area in 1916 and 17. Griggs' findings brought more public attention to the area, garnering support for the creation of the Katmai National Monument. President Woodrow Wilson would establish the Katmai National Monument on September 24, 1918. The act had little effect, however, as no personnel were assigned to the monument. It would not be until 1937 when the monument was first assigned a ranger. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed an act that expanded the monument's borders significantly on August 4, 1941. Several groups would call for a reduction in size or disestablishment to allow mining and fishing, as the National Park Service had not attempted to develop the area for visitors. Operation Great Lands, a report on Alaskan public lands commissioned by George B. Hartzog Jr., the director of the National Park Service from 1964 to 72, recommended the expansion of Katmai National Monument by nearly 150 square miles, which was signed in 1968 by President Lyndon B. Johnson. Another expansion would occur under President Jimmy Carter, adding an additional 2,140 square miles to the monument. The Alaskan National Interest Lands Conservation Act, passed on December 2, 1980, would establish the Katmai National Park and Preserve in its current state. Kenai Fjords National Park was the fifth national park to be established in Alaska and the 45th in the nation. With an area of 1,047 square miles, Kenai Fjords is the smallest national park in Alaska, more than 1,600 square miles smaller than the second smallest park in Alaska, Kobuk Valley, at roughly the same size as the European country of Luxembourg. Evidence of settlements from as early as 950 AD have been discovered within the park's boundaries, with more modern settlements being inhabited into the 20th century. Several Russian settlements would be established in the vicinity of Kenai in the late 1700s. Following the purchase of Alaska from Russia by Secretary of State William Seward, The Alaskan city of Seward would be founded near the Kenai Fjords in 1903. This city would be the origin of the Alaska Railroad, extending to Whittier, Anchorage, Fairbanks, and the interior of the Alaskan wilderness. This railroad, prompting the growth of early Seward, brought more attention to the Kenai Fjords. The first studies of potential National Park Service sites would occur throughout the 1930s and 40s, suggesting the protection of Kenai Fjords. The first proposals were discussed by the National Park Service in the late 1970s. However, due to native claims, the NPS could not lay claim to the area. Instead, several areas of the Kenai Peninsula were set aside as protected lands to be reassigned in the future under the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act on December 18, 1971. President Jimmy Carter would establish the Kenai Fjords National Park on December 2, 1980, after signing the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. Kobuk Valley National Park was the 6th national park to be established in Alaska and the 46th in the country. The park covers 2,736 square miles, making it the second smallest in Alaska behind only Kenai Fjords, and the 9th largest in the nation at a size roughly comparable to Delaware. With no infrastructure, the only way in or out of Kobuk Valley is via plane, with no visitor center to be found. The valley, home to Native Americans since as long as 10,000 years ago, is located between the Barrett Mountains to the north and the Waring Mountains to the south, with the Kobuk River flowing between the two. Kobuk Valley is most famous for its caribou, more than 500,000 of which migrate across the Kobuk River twice a year. In fact, it was largely due to the caribou's migration through the area that the park was established in the first place. Onion Portage, an area of the river where the water is much shallower, is where countless caribou can be seen crossing the river. To the south of the Waring Mountains lie the Great Kobuk Sand Dunes, often called the Sahara of the Arctic. The climate of the region varies greatly, with temperatures in January being consistently below zero and temperatures from the mid-50s to the upper 60s in July. President Jimmy Carter would establish Kobuk Valley as a national monument on December 1, 1978. And would promote it to national park with the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act 2 years later. Lake Clark National Park and Preserve was the 7th national park to be established in Alaska and the 47th in the nation. The park has an area of 6,297 square miles, making it the 6th largest in Alaska and the 7th largest in the nation at around the size of Connecticut. Lake Clark also doesn't have any built-up infrastructure, meaning access is mostly via small aircraft. Lake Clark, the park's namesake, is a 43-mile-long, 5-mile-wide lake named for John Clark, the first American to spot the lake on an 1891 voyage. Rainforests line the Alaskan coast within and surrounding the park, along with the Chigmit, Niekala, and Aleutian mountain ranges. The park also hosts 2 active volcanoes, Mount Iliamna and Redoubt, the latter of which erupted recently in 1989 and again in 2009. Lake Clark is popular among anglers, with river trout, northern pike, and 5 unique types of salmon inhabiting the lake. Captain James Cook would survey the Cook Inlet region in 1778, even noting his sighting of Mount Redoubt. Americans would arrive in the late 19th century looking to trade with the natives and Russians of the region. Richard Pernecki, a nature writer and craftsman, would arrive at Lake Clark in 1968, constructing a log cabin by hand on the shore of Twin Lakes and living off the land. His journals and recordings documenting his time spent near Lake Clark would later be compiled into a documentary, produced posthumously, titled Alone in the Wilderness, allowing Pernecki to spread his conservationist message to millions. His cabin, within the park, is now on the National Register of Historic Places. Jimmy Carter would create the Lake Clark National Monument on December 1, 1978, and would later promote it to national park when the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act passed 2 years later. Wrangell-St. Elias National Park and Preserve was the 8th national park to be established in Alaska and the 48th in the country. This park is the single largest national park in the U.S. with an area of 20,587 square miles, making it around the size of the country of Croatia. This park is so large, in fact, that it would fit Yellowstone within it nearly 6 times. Compared to many Alaskan parks, Wrangell-St. Elias is a fairly popular destination for tourists, with over 80,000 visiting each year. Part of this is due to its location only 200 miles outside of Anchorage. 3 mountain ranges make up Wrangell-St. Elias. Firstly, the Wrangell Mountains in the north, the Chugach Range to the south, and the St. Elias Range to the east. This range's namesake, Mount St. Elias, is the second tallest peak in the US, only beaten by Denali. Danish explorer Vitus Bering, hired by the Russian Tsar, would be the first European to arrive in Wrangell-St. Elias in the early 1700s. Bering traveled the channel from Siberia to Alaska, which now bears his name, with his fleet soon arriving off the coast of eastern Alaska. It was on the feast day of St. Elias that they would spot Mount St. Elias, naming the peak in his honor. The other half of the park's name would come from the governor of Russia's Alaskan colonies, Ferdinand von Wrangell, the man in charge of maintaining Russian control of the region over the various Native Americans in the area. Wrangell would keep the colonies intact until Russia sold its territory to the United States in 1867, with the Americans now in control, regarding Wrangell as a hero of sorts. They would name Mount Wrangell in his honor, which would later give the park the first half of its name. President Carter would establish Wrangell-St. Elias as a national monument on December 1, 1978, and would establish it as a national park when he signed the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act 2 years later. These 8 Alaskan national parks host some of the most renowned sites in the national park system, all while being over 1,000 miles removed from the continental states. From mountains to rivers and forests, these parks work to preserve what's left of America's last frontier. This is 435 American. Thanks for watching.